Hey, New Life Church, I'm Pastor Stephanie, and it's time for our TRAC devotion for the week. Well, we just finished the book of Habakkuk, and what an interesting book, and what wonderful things to glean from it. And that's what I want to talk about today. This is a really unique situation here. Here we have the prophet Habakkuk, and he is actually coming to God on behalf of the people. And usually we see prophets coming to the people on behalf of God. So really we see in chapters 1 and 2, really it's just this Q&A. Habakkuk is asking the questions and God is responding. And then in chapter 3, we have this wonderful prayer of praise that we get from Habakkuk, from the discussion with God. So I just want to talk about that a little bit. So Habakkuk is just asking God, where is the justice? Aren't you a just God? Here we have, we see enemies rising up and taking victory. But what about us? Do you still see us, Lord? Are you still a God of justice? And God is saying, yes, I am a God of justice. In fact, he answers Habakkuk and he says, not only are the enemies rising up and seeing victory, but in the future, I am going to use a particular enemy to overcome Judah, and that's going to be the Babylonians. And God is very, very specific with Habakkuk. And then he says in verse 5 and 6 in chapter 1, he says, you're going to see this nation and you're going to be utterly amazed. And then God says in verse 6, I am rising up the Babylonians. And then he goes on to explain how ruthless they are and how powerful they're going to be. Not probably what Habakkuk was expecting. And then in chapter 2, God is saying, you might not see this happening, but in due time, it's going to happen, because when God says something, he means it, and it will eventually happen. So, God is saying you're not going to see it right away. It's going to be in the future, but wait patiently. It's going to come, because God is always true to his word. And that's true in this situation, which was going to be, bad for the people of Judah. But it's what God had to do to get their hearts right, to get their hearts focused on him. And we know that. But it's also true in our situations too, whether it's for the good. Sometimes God promises things and we have to wait, and we have to wait patiently. God will do things exactly in his timing. And he's not going to be swayed by us. He's not going to be swayed by our emotions. He's not going to be swayed by what we want. God is sovereign, and we have to trust that. And Habakkuk had to trust God as well. In fact, God said, let's see if I can find it real quick, in chapter 2, that even though all this is going to happen and Judah's going to be overtaken, he says, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. There's going to be a small remnant that comes out, and they're going to show their faithfulness to God even in these hard times. And what a lesson to us as well, that we have to live by faith, that we have to live by our faithfulness to God, not by our own understanding, as we know, not by what we feel, not by what other people are saying. It's what God is saying. We have his word, and we have to stand strong on that. No matter what situations come in our life, no matter how bad things get, God is still good. God is still sovereign. He is still in control, and we have to wait patiently. We see that message in chapter 1 and 2. And then let's be like Habakkuk. Let's be like him in chapter 3, giving this wonderful, wonderful verses of praise to who God is. We see in verses 3 and 15, he gives praise to God, and he remembers God and his power and how God saves and how he redeems. And in verse 16 and 19 in chapter 3, Habakkuk expresses to trust God in crisis, that we can rejoice in the Lord and stand firm in the joy of our salvation, no matter what. We always will have the joy of our salvation, and we can proclaim the strength of the Lord. Let me just read to you a little bit of what Habakkuk writes at the end of chapter 3. Let's see. Let's start with it's hard to know where to start. Let's start with verse 17. He's talking, he's reflecting what God says about the Babylonians, and he starts to tremble and wonder. But this is then what he says in verse 17. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the field and the cattle barns are empty. Here we go, people. Verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. So Habakkuk is saying, no matter how bad it gets, I am going to rejoice in the Lord. That's the attitude that we need to have, my friends. No matter how bad it gets, we rejoice in the Lord. And he continues, I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer and able to tread upon the heights. Wow, what a message that we need to hear. We can always have strength in God. We can always have the joy in the Lord. And then he says that we can be sure-footed as the deer. Think about that. A deer never losing its step and never falling no matter what's happening. The deer, like when they're prancing around, it's like they're positively dancing and leaping in the hills, and they are filled with life and joy. So that picture is us. No matter what's happening, we can be leaping for joy. We can be sure-footed. We don't have to fall. We don't have to falter under the enemy's attack. We can stay strong under the winds of our attack because of the joy of the Lord, because of the strength of God, because he has given us everything to stand, and we have his word, and we can know that God is sovereign, and in his timing, everything will happen, and we can have that trust, and we can have that joy. We can be as sure-footed as the deer, able to tread upon the heights. Take that wonderful word and remember it and apply it to your life, New Life Church. You won't be disappointed because God is an awesome God. It's been great spending some time with you. I'll see you next time. Enjoy your reading. Bye.